World War II is known to have terrible human atrocities such as the Holocaust and some of its facilities with mass killings like Auschwitz, Dachau, or Treblinka. But oftentimes the human experiment lab from Japan gets overlooked when we review the history of experiment death camps in World War II. This gruesome biological and chemical warfare research facility, operated by the Imperial Japanese Army known as Unit 731. This lab took in many inmates, mainly Chinese prisoners of war, Soviets, and some Allied prisoners. The unfortunate truth is that every person who went into Unit 731 never came out. None of these inmates survived, including babies born. All human subjects would have their lives ended after they entered the doors. Some tests were for the intended use of biological chemical warfare use on the United States. Some of these prisoners were directly given diseases or gruesome disabilities without anesthetics to see how they could operate on them to fix it for medical knowledge to benefit their soldiers. If the victim survived any of these testings, they would still be put to death afterwards, either by being shot, lethal injection, starved, forced dehydration, pressurized, or being buried alive. Here is a list of tests used at Unit 731. Prisoners' limbs were forcefully submerged in a tub of water filled with ice and was held there until the arm or leg was completely frozen solid. According to eyewitness accounts, the limbs would make the sound like a plank of wood when struck with by a cane. Treatment testing was used without anesthetics, and the different methods tried to treat the frostbite were as listed: rapid rewarming of a frozen appendage, throwing hot water on the limb at different temperatures, leaving the subject untreated overnight to see how long until the blood would thaw out, and by holding it close to an open fire. The best result was to have hot water between 100 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit thrown at the frozen limb. Vivisections is the practice of mutilating human bodies without anesthesia to study the operations of living systems. Of those operated on would be men, women, the elderly, and children. Unit 731 started investigating the effects of disease and injury to develop a better understanding of their armed forces. Subjects would be forcefully infected with diseases such as cholera and the plague, then had their organs removed for examination before they died, in order to study the effects of the disease without decomposition that occurs after death. Subjects had limbs amputated and reattached to the other side of the body, while others had their limbs crushed or frozen, or had the circulation cut off to observe the progress of gangrene. The weapon tests were to observe the effectiveness of weapons used on another person to benefit the knowledge of the Japanese Army. Unit 731 packed prisoners together on a firing range and fired at them from varying ranges by several Japanese weapons, such as the Nambu 8mm pistol, bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and grenades. Penetration depths and wounded patterns were then compared on the bodies of dead and dying victims. Bayonets, swords, and knives were also studied in this manner. Flamethrowers were also used to test on clothed and unclothed victims. Gas chambers were installed to test nerve gas and blister agents. Heavy objects were dropped onto bound prisoners to study crush injuries, and subjects locked up were deprived of food and water to see how long they could survive without them. Then they were only given seawater or mismatched human blood or animal blood to study transfusions on what the clotting process looked like. Prolonged X-ray exposure also sterilized and killed thousands of research patients. To study the effects of high G-forces on pilots and falling paratroopers, Unit 731 loaded victims into large centrifuges and spun them consistently at higher and higher speeds until they passed out or died. This proved to happen around 10 to 15 Gs. Young children proved to have a lower tolerance for acceleration force. Venereal disease has been around organized military since ancient Egypt, so the Japanese military were interested in the symptoms and treatment of syphilis. In order to learn from this, they infected prisoners with the disease and denied them treatment to observe the full course of the illness. To ensure transmission, male prisoners were ordered to have sex with female prisoners, who would then be monitored to observe the onset of the disease. If the first attempt failed to produce, sex would be ordered again, and again with other inmates until infection could be established. The reason for forced pregnancy on female inmates was to use the testing methods as already mentioned to see how a fetus would respond so it could be studied. Pregnant women would undergo being infected with diseases, chemical weapons, crush injuries, shot at, and dealt shrapnel from explosives. As told by the doctors, this was to be done so findings could benefit civilian medicine. Unit 731 became interested in the larger objective of developing horrific weapons and mass destruction for the use against the Chinese population and presumably American and Soviet forces, ignoring the Geneva Convention and going to any means possible to poison and kill their enemies. So how did Unit 731 operate in plain sight? It was a covert operation, and its name from the outside was falsely labeled as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Because Unit 731 was also near a wooded area, it notified the locals it also operated as a lumber mill. Also, because of this, subjects of 731 were often referred to and documented as logs. After the war, Americans and Soviets raced to grab doctors and their information for their own gain. Americans had the doctor trials after the war. None of the doctors or staff from 731 were punished for their war crimes, even including torture and death of Allied prisoners. This was for the classified information and cooperation at the time. Unlike Nazi doctors who were punished for their crimes, Japanese doctors would re-enter society and continue with successful careers. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and hit the bell if you want to be notified when the next video goes live. I appreciate you all for listening, and until next time, take care.